You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am really excited to have one of my favorite authors on the show. Don Winslow is here today, and he has a brand new book that, when you're hearing this, is available everywhere. You can go grab it at your local bookstore, or we'll have links down in the show notes to make it easy. The new book is called City on Fire, and if you're a fan of Don Winslow the way I am, you know that this is a must-have if you're a crime fiction fan. Don has done it yet again for his 21st novel, I believe it is, and it just gets better and better and better, if you can believe that. Welcome to the show, Don.
Oh, thanks, Hank, and thanks for the kind words, man. I appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Don, before we get started, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Yeah, good one. You know, I grew up, my dad was a sailor who was an inveterate reader, and my mom was a librarian. And so there were always books around the house. But I would have to say that my first memory of wanting to be a writer was at about age 7 or 8. And I was reading, there was a series of books called You Were There. And it was always about a boy and a girl. And they were there at some sort of historical event, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Johnstown flood. I'm sorry.
I think I remember that series.
Do you? Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
And I could read. Yeah, I could remember like reading the one about Gettysburg, and thinking, yeah, boy, wouldn't it be great if I could tell stories like this? If I could be a writer.
That's fantastic. You know, if you think about the family that we come from. It's, you know, if you believe that we are a product of our upbringing and, you know, our family lineage, having one parent as a sailor and another parent as a librarian, that's a pretty fantastic place to come from.
Well, it is, because my dad, you know, was a raconteur. He was a great storyteller, in addition to being a great reader. And yeah, oh yeah, my God, he and his Navy buddies, you know, would get together and start telling stories, and I would just sit and listen and be fascinated. The other thing, you know, it's funny because I have one sibling, an older sister, who's also a professional novelist, and so 2 kids in the family, both of whom became writers.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And you know, looking back over your bio. Don, you know, as someone who grew up in that sort of setting and had this early inkling that he wanted to be a writer, then of course your path would take you to college in the Midwest to study about Africa. What other path would there be?
Yeah. Are you expressing some sort of surprise there?
What drew you to the continent of Africa?
Oh, boy. Originally a book called Something of Value by Robert Rourke that my dad turned me on to. I think I was maybe 12 or 13 years old. And look, it's dated now. You reread it. It has its problems. I think it was a product of its time. But it was about Kenya and safari guides in Kenya and what eventually became known as the Mau Mau Revolution, you know, the Kenya's drive for independence. And I thought right then and there, man, I'm going to Africa. You know, I want to do that.
So, you traveled all over the world, eventually settled in New York, to pursue your passion of writing. Did you move to New York specifically to become a writer?
Oh, sure. Like so many other people, I finished my undergraduate degree in African history, which makes you a hardcore unemployable. And I spent a little time up in northern Idaho, um, delivering salad dressing, believe it or not, to various restaurants.
As one
And
does.
and then I moved to New York, as one does,
Yeah.
to become a writer. And of course, I was a starving writer within days, and got a job managing movie theaters.
Wow. You know the what is the there's a romantic ideal of moving to New York to become a writer. Is that because the publishing industry has been rooted in New York for so long? Is there some other draw to that brings writers to New York, or is it just because that's where the hub of publishing tends to be?
I think it's mostly because that's where publishing is. I grew up about 2.5 hours by train north of the city in a little town in Rhode Island, where the book's set. And man, I used to love the rare chances I had to get on that train, though, as a kid, and go to that city, with the buildings and the streets and the movies and the theater and all of that. But I think that there is a romantic notion, at least among writers of my generation, about going to New York and getting published and meeting that great editor. Now, many years later, I realized that romantic ideal. I was doing a book with the late great Sonny Mehta at Knopf, and I'll never forget it. Getting on the train to go down to New York to meet Sonny at his apartment and sit up all night at the kitchen table with the manuscript in front of us and debating and arguing and working on the book, and then finishing it and walking out onto the streets of Manhattan at dawn, and I felt like, man, I had that quintessentially romantic writer experience then.
Wow. The is that something that still happens in publishing? The relationship with an editor like that, where you do kind of toil and hammer at the manuscript and argue back and forth about whether this character is working in this situation, or is that something that still happens, or is that kind of faded into a romantic ideal?
I think it still happens, but I think, certainly editors edit, no question about it.
Sure.
And there's always the dialogue, with the writer, of course. But anymore, and part of this, of course, is COVID. I think it's more remote, it's via email, it's via phone. Where back in the day, you literally sat down with these folks, and it had a different kind of feeling to it, I think.
Yeah. As writers, you look at life experience and think that no life experience is invaluable, or is not valuable. That we can draw from the most odd places for a character to come out, or whatever. Having a degree in African history, you said, makes you immediately unemployable. But do you ever pull on that experience? Has that ever benefited you in your writing? And has it ever come back to inform something that you're working on?
Not directly, but I went on from there and worked for several years as a safari guide on photographic safaris. And there were certain, I think, skills that you honed on that job, of observation, of detail, because that was what it was all about, to get your clients in a position to find those animals and photograph them. You had to develop a certain, body of knowledge and a certain way of observing the world. And I really do think that helped me down the road in the writing.
Yeah. A lot of writers, especially in your genre, love to develop series characters, recurring characters that that readers can lock onto and feel some sort of connection to and follow along from book to book, and that benefits writers in a lot of ways. It also puts up some blocks in a sort of way, because if you have a main series character, you as the reader, that character is going to be mostly safe from book to book. You may do a little torture here and there, but we know they're going to show back up next book to take on a new challenge or whatever. Looking back over your catalog, I don't think you have any recurring characters. Are all 20 something of your books standalones?
No, in fact, my first 5 books were a series, the Neil Carey series, because I was reading the same stuff that you're alluding to. When I was thinking about doing this, and I was reading, obviously Chandler and the McDonald's,
right.
but also, of course, Robert Parker and other folks, and I just thought, well, that's what you do. And so when I started, my first book, I think, is called A Cool Breeze on the Underground. I intended that to be a series, and it went for 5 books. Later on, I did this, people sort of refer to it as the Drug Trilogy or the Cartel Trilogy, these 3 big books on the Mexican drug cartels. And there were, that featured a guy named Art Keller through those 3 books, and there were a lot of recurring characters. And then, in this trilogy, we'll follow a guy named Danny Ryan all the way through, and a lot of the other characters. I love those series. I don't think I could tell you, for instance, the plot of one Spencer novel, and yet I read them all. Right. And you just want to hang out with those people in that place. The plot and I think there's a certain comfort in the plot is Spencer. The plot is Spencer and Susan and Hawk in the kitchen,
right.
And they're so beautifully written, and you just want to be with those people, So I think there's a lot of value to those series. I love them. I found that after 5 books, I was getting bad at it. That and I wanted to move on and do something different. But boy, I love that genre, and there's so many, great writers who've done them. Yeah.
You during your time in New York, you spent time as a private investigator. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, sure did.
I would imagine some of those experiences informed your writing.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Look, I think more, though, in terms of attitude and ways of looking at the world,
Right.
I rarely would take any of the cases that I worked on and turn them into books. There's a reason it's called private investigator,
right,
as opposed to public investigator. But one of the jobs that I had was tracking runaways, trying to find runaways, and I certainly used that experience in a fictional way in my first book, A Cool Breeze on the Underground, which is about a guy who's sent to London to find a missing teenage girl. But it was more, listen, when I was a private investigator, I started in Times Square in New York before Mickey Mouse got there. So it was dirty, it was gritty, it was dangerous, it was sad. And Hank, I have to confess that I have a certain nostalgia for that. I kind of miss the soulfulness of it. And some of the adrenaline rush of it. Later in life, I went back to that field. mostly but not exclusively in California, but at a higher level. I was mostly interviewing witnesses and helping law firms get ready for trials and that kind of thing. So my street work at that point was pretty much over.
I think I'm glad you talked about the difference between private investigation and public investigation, and kind of made a joke about that. But I think a lot of new writers, are looking for life experiences that they can then springboard into, a fiction writing career, and I think they focus too much on looking for a situation that they can record and tell their view on, instead of just letting life experiences inform the way they see things, or that letting their imagination run wild with this information that they have. As a writer who has obviously experienced a lot of these sorts of things, or been closely connected with some of these people, how do you prevent real life from seeping into your stories, and just allowing your imagination to be free?
I have to remind myself of that. My education is as a historian, and so I tend to be maybe a bit pedantic when I'm writing, particularly in early drafts, or thinking that I have to be too faithful to the real life situations that I'm drawing on. And so every once in a while, I kind of have to hit myself, up alongside the head and say, hey, Don, you're writing a novel. You're allowed to use your imagination. You're allowed to create. You're allowed to reorder some things in chronology to make the structure of the novel better. But I really do. I have to make an effort, because I always think, well, I have to include every incident, right?
Yeah.
To be thorough, as one would have done when you were an investigator, when preparing investigative reports, right? You're not going to leave anything out, but then realize, no, hold on. You're writing a novel. It has to have a certain kind of structure to it so that it's friendly to the reader. And so it's a matter of kind of snapping my head back and reminding myself. I really share your point, though, about a lot of aspiring writers, because I want to say the same, and do say the same thing to them. It's just let loose, just wail away on that keyboard and see what happens, Yeah.
Don, one of the things that I love to hear writers talk about is the moment of creation, or the moment of inspiration. And I'll explain what I'm asking. Is with a book like City on Fire, at one moment it does not exist in any form, fashion. It just doesn't exist. And then either a character walks onto the stage of your mind, and you're like, well, who is this? And what are they up to? And a scene starts to unfold, based around this character. Or maybe you're reading, a newspaper article, and, the imagination starts firing off. Or maybe you're watching a documentary, or, this novel, we travel back in time to the 80s and 90s, the 1980s and 1990s. And, maybe there's something about that time period that, that starts to erupt. And then in that moment, City on Fire does exist in some form. And then it's up to you as the writer to start excavating that story, and to dig out who these characters are and what they're up to. What is that first moment of inspiration usually like for you?
Wow, that's quite a question. It's almost always character. It's almost always a person. In this case, there was sort of a twofold inspiration for these books. One was my past childhood, the growing up in New England at a time when there was a lot of mob violence and conflict. And then the other was reading the Greek and Roman classics. And I started to read the Iliad, and it reminded me, I know this sounds a little crazy, so much of the New England crime wars, even the incident that touched it all off. The Helen of Troy thing had very modern parallels. And so my imagination began to go to what other parallels are there? And then I just had this guy, Danny Ryan, had this image of him lying on a beach where I grew up and seeing this woman come out of the water and knowing somehow that moment was going to change everything. But I didn't know how. And so it really was a matter of kind of living with him for years. I wrote that first chapter 27 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And then, yeah. I've put this thing, down and picked it up numerous times over those years because it just kept calling to me. Sometimes you write something and you think, yeah, nice first chapter, can't go anywhere, fun afternoon, I guess. But this just kept coming back and back and back, saying, do something with it. And so finally I did, But those moments, I don't know how to explain them. I wrote a novella called The San Diego Zoo, based on a sentence that was running in my mind for years. The sentence was, nobody knows how the chimp got the revolver. I had no clue what that meant. It was just in my head literally for years. And I kind of chuckle at it, And then one day I sat down and thought, all right, how did the chimp get the revolver? And then just made it up as I went along, I swear to God, I was writing that novella and I didn't know what happened until it happened.
Those are the fun parts of being a writer, that moment of almost silly inspiration that then becomes a living, breathing thing.
Yeah, absolutely. My first book, A Cool Breeze on the Underground, was similar. I was working in London and was down in the subway, the tube.
Yeah.
It was the hottest summer in recorded English history. And I'm sweating down there in the Tottenham Square tube station. And inexplicably, a cool breeze came up through the tunnel. Wow. And I had this phrase, a cool breeze on the underground. Again, never associating it with anything. But eventually, when I decided, okay, I'm going to get serious, I'm going to sit down and write a book, that title came back to me. And so then it inspires questions. Well, who's on the underground to feel the cool breeze? Why is he there? What's he doing? Who is he? And all those great questions that we get to ask, started to flesh themselves out. And eventually, I think it was about 3 years later, I had a book. 15 publishers disagreed, but eventually someone published it,
It's so funny to look back at, different people's publishing stories, because, most everyone has, we've done over 1,200 episodes of this show, and there have been a handful of authors, I mean a handful, who wrote a manuscript and then just everyone was clamoring to get their hands on that manuscript. There are a few of those people, but a very few.
Yeah, sure.
And we love to kind of say, look, the publishing industry, they didn't know what they were talking about. This thing that was rejected 40 times went on to sell 4 bajillion copies. And yeah, I mean, there's some of that is deserved, but sometimes you can't blame an industry for not being able to see what's around the corner, and thank God that readers get to vote with their money, I guess.
Yeah, I never got angry. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'd get the rejection letters. A lot of people save them, which I do not understand, why you would collect them. I would just crumple them up and throw them away and keep on writing. I had read somewhere in those days that 1 out of every 10,000 people who put writer down on their tax form make a living at it.
Yeah.
Don't know if that's true or not. But I remember saying to myself, I'm very sorry, sincerely sorry, for the other 9,999. But in this life, that's my slot.
Right.
So while the whole publishing industry, including the publishers I've been with since, were rejecting the first Neil Carey novel, I was writing the second one.
Things We Never Got Over, the new book by best-selling author Lucy Score. Bearded bad boy barber Knox refers to live his life the way he takes his coffee, alone, unless you count his basset hound Waylon. Knox doesn't tolerate drama even when it comes in the form of a stranded runaway bride. Naomi wasn't just running away from her wedding, she was riding to the rescue of her estranged twin to Knockemout, Virginia, a rough-around-the-edges town where disputes are settled the old-fashioned way, with fist and beer, usually in that order. Too bad for Naomi, her evil twin hasn't changed at all. After helping herself to Naomi's car and cash, Tina leaves her with something unexpected, the niece Naomi didn't know she had. Now she's stuck in town with no car, no job, no plan, and no home, with an 11-year-old going on 30 to take care of. There's a reason Knox doesn't do complications or high-maintenance women, especially not the romantic ones. But since Naomi's life imploded right in front of him, the least he can do is help her out of her jam. And just as soon as she stops getting into new trouble, he can leave her alone and get back to his peaceful, solitary life. At least that's the plan until the trouble turns to real danger. Things We Never Got Over, the new book by best-selling author Lucy Score. An Innocent Client, the first book in the Joe Dillard legal thriller series. A preacher is found brutally murdered in a Tennessee motel room. A beautiful, mysterious young girl is accused. In this best-selling debut, criminal defense lawyer Joe Dillard has become jaded over the years as he's tried to balance his career against his conscience. Savvy but cynical, Dillard wants to quit doing criminal defense, but he can't resist the chance to represent someone who might actually be innocent. His drug-addicted sister has just been released from prison, and his mother is succumbing to Alzheimer's, but Dillard's commitment to the case never wavers despite the personal troubles and professional demands that threaten to destroy him. Chosen by BookBub readers as one of the top 100 crime novels of all time, get started on this great series with An Innocent Client, where it all started. Read for free with Kindle Unlimited or buy it in paperback or audiobook. An Innocent Client by Scott Pratt.
And that's the attitude you have to have, isn't it? I interviewed Brandon Sanderson, the famous fantasy author, several years ago, and he, I think he was writing his 13th novel when his first one finally sold. I think it was like the 7th that he had written when it finally sold, and he said, "What you don't understand is that I was a writer. Whether anyone believed me or not and chose to publish that's a whole other thing." He said, "I was a writer, and if no one would have published it, then I would have just kept writing novels for my own enjoyment. And when I'm old and died, my kids were going to inherit a house that was full of manuscripts stuffed in every closet, because that's just the reality of it." And I think at some point you have to kind of find some peace with that decision. Like, this is what I'm going to do. If no one else realizes how great I am, then well, their loss.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I say this to aspiring writers all the time. I say to them, if you sit down and you struggle with the empty page, or I guess it's the blank screen now, on a regular basis, and you make an effort at it and you write, you are a writer. We're colleagues. You have my respect. You are a writer, and don't let anyone ever take that away from you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Don, you talked about City on Fire and the ancient stories that you started seeing similarities with. I think King Solomon said at first that there's nothing new under the sun, and that's really funny. The way human nature comes back around and around and around. There are only a handful of story types in the world, and we just find new ways of telling those stories over and over. What after 20 something novels have come out, how do you continue to find inspiration, and how do you remain a happy person when writing some stories that are about some of the worst parts of human nature?
Yeah. Those are tough questions. Listen, I have never had a problem with inspiration or finding things to write about. The world is just too fascinating. I think that the opposite problem exists. Is there's so much to write about and only so much time, and what do you choose?
Right.
That's more the issue for me. On the second question, look, there was a while that was rough. I spent 23 years writing about the Mexican drug cartels and the war on drugs and addiction and and all of that, and the research for that was hard. It was brutal. And writing those scenes, because those books in many ways are virtually documentaries. There's nothing in them that didn't actually happen in one form or another. That became a bit of a problem. In fact, after I wrote the first in that, I never intended to write a trilogy, by the way. And after I wrote the first book in what is now the trilogy, I swore I wouldn't write another one.
Wow.
And then I ended up writing a book called The Cartel, which described probably the most horrifically violent era in Mexico. And after that, I promised everybody, myself, I promised my wife, that I would not write another one. And then I went on and wrote the third and final called The Border, because I felt that I had a responsibility, in a sense, to bring that story home and to write about America. And so, I did. It was sort of almost a matter of separating yourself at the end of the day, taking a break and going for a walk or something before I went home, because I didn't want to bring that stuff home.
Right.
And I was somewhat used to that in my life as an investigator. That you had certain kind of cases, and there's no need for us to discuss them here, but it's nothing you're going to bring home to your wife and your kid,
right.
And so you just had to make this almost physical effort to kind of cleanse yourself and come home and think, okay, now I'm a husband and a father.
How do you go about doing research for books like that? And I'm sure City on Fire was a little different because it is a historical setting, even though a setting that I remember too well from my adulthood. So I hate to call it a historical setting, but not to tell our age or anything. But when you're like the Mexican drug cartels, how does a novelist, how do you start? Because you said, a lot of those things did happen, in one way or another. How do you get close enough to get, real facts to make it believable, from your comfy writing chair?
It changed over the years. when I wrote the first one, I had no knowledge or interest, for that matter, in drug trafficking. And when I started to write the book, I was just looking for answers for myself. So I started reading history, and then I would read journalism, and then I would read documents. And when I felt I had sort of enough of a baseline knowledge, then I went out and started talking to people. And that was a matter of networking, finding someone who'd be willing to talk to you, who might pass you on to somebody else. Writing the second book, everything changed because of social media and the internet. Because when I was writing the first book, the cartels were trying to disguise what they did. By the early 2000s, they were proclaiming what they did. They'd put it out, on the net. And you could follow the drug wars almost the way you'd follow a baseball season. Now I, of course, still went out and talked to people and went to locations and all of that kind of thing. But it was a very, very different kind of an era, in an almost evil sense, I mean, these guys would do horrible things, make videos of them, and email them to you.
Yeah. Wow. With a novel like City on Fire, your new novel, when you kind of have the inspiration for it, and you start seeing a connection with ancient stories, and start seeing a contrast, but not just a contrast, almost a juxtaposition of modern life with ancient life, and you start seeing the same human problems that have come around for generation upon generation. How do you start preparing for a book like this? And was it the setting, in the 1980s and 1990s? What was it that was so intentional about that time period?
Yeah, I knew that I was going to stay with this character for 15 to 20 years of his life. And so I was looking around at what was happening on the American crime scene. And I knew I needed a certain chunk of time that would reflect what I wanted to write about. And so that meant starting it in the 1980s. Also, that worked out nicely because that was an era when the mafia was in decline, was starting its really steep downhill pitch. And I think that the decline of things is quite interesting to write about, and so that worked out well. Also, the research for that book, a lot of it, of course, was learning more about the classics, listening to lectures, reading scholarly works, literary criticism, and that kind of thing to get a deeper understanding of those themes that you alluded to. The rest of it was the realm of memory. I lived there half the year. And so a lot of it was a matter of walking out the door and making a short drive. The scenes in that book are intimate to me. And then it was a matter of remembering those years and what they were like and those people. So it's a very different experience from doing, let's say, the drug trilogy.
When you start envisioning a story, Don, like you knew that you wanted to follow this character for a big chunk of his life, do you start planning out the story before you start drafting? Do you have an arc that you see this character following, and maybe you don't have all of the scenes shaded in and all of that, but is there a roadmap that you follow?
Not really. In this sense, look, the roadmap was kind of the Aeneid. I had three broad strokes, and I don't want to give away too much in the first book. Yeah. But I knew that this guy was going to have to leave his home. I knew that he was going to have to wander, and I knew that he was going to have to build his own empire all the time that he's trying to leave his past behind him. That's what I had, Yeah. And then it was a matter of finding the modern parallels that made sense, I mean, what would a Trojan horse be in 1987?
Right.
I had to find that. Aeneas, on his wanderings, for instance, is shipwrecked, and off the shore, he walks into a cave and he sees murals of the Trojan War, sees himself, sees his late friend, sees his late wife, sees his home. What's the modern equivalent of that? So the second book is set primarily in Hollywood, because that would be the modern equivalent of that, a film. What sort of empire is he going to build in the 1990s?
Right.
And so the third book takes him to Las Vegas to build a casino empire. So those are the broad strokes. And then I follow other characters too, Helen and Cassandra and Aphrodite and Agamemnon and Odysseus, all in the modern criminal world. Now, I hasten to add that you can read these books with no interest, knowledge, or reference to the classics at all. I think you can enjoy these books just as contemporary crime novels, but they take their themes from these classics.
It's funny that you start seeing a shadow of the hero's journey, almost, and this classic story structure that following a character's growth and challenges and all of that. Is it exciting to you when you start to make those connections? When you're comparing modern history to the Iliad and start seeing ways that you can connect that. Does that invigorate you and get you excited about the project?
Absolutely. You get these eureka moments, like when I first figured out what the Trojan horse would be, and I don't want to give it away. I was like, yes, that's it. I can write that. That makes sense. Same with the murals and a cave wall,
Right.
Like, what's that? But then I go, bam, film. Yes, that's exciting. And that brings me to a world that I know and that I think people are going to enjoy spending time in. And so, yeah, it's absolutely exciting to do that. I just hope it's exciting to read,
Yeah. Well, I've read the book. I got an early arc, and then I got a finished hardcover. I guess about a week or two ago from your publisher, and I flipped through it again and just kind of relived some of the moments of the book, and it's so much fun. And even though it's kind of grim subject matter in a lot of ways, it's so much fun. How do you balance those, kind of the worst parts of human nature with making it, epically readable, that you just keep wanting to turn the pages to find out what these characters are up to?
Well, I think that's life, isn't it? I mean, I think that reflects reality, in the sense that we're constantly, on that high wire between tragedy and comedy.
Right.
We have to laugh. God, we didn't laugh. Heck, what will we do?
Exactly.
I mean, these past few years, man.
Yeah.
If we didn't laugh, I don't know what. I think on the sort of technical creative question you asked, in early drafts, I just write. I just wail away as fast as I can, as if I'm afraid of being caught. As I get into later drafts, more and more I have the reader in mind. We sometimes forget that reading is a physical as well as intellectual activity. It's visual and it's oral, because we hear it. We hear those words, we see the page. And so I'm trying to shape the words and shape the page and shape the pacing to give the reader the best possible experience, So very early drafts, it's a completely selfish activity. And in the late drafts, though, all I'm thinking about is what's the reader seeing, what's the reader hearing, what's the reader feeling.
Don, we know that writing can be a very solitary pursuit, and that most writers spend the vast majority of their working time, locked in an office by themselves, and or maybe they go to a coffee shop so that they can be around people, but they're not interacting with anyone. They're maybe listening, observing, but typing, and it can be very inward focused. Let's just put it that way. What do you do to make sure that you stay connected with a community of some sort? Maybe it's other writers that you are bouncing ideas off of, or maybe it's just sharing some inspiration, some encouragement, or maybe it's just staying connected to family. But what does community mean to you in a line of work that can be so solitary?
Yeah, I often say, I spend almost all day with people who don't actually exist,
chasing ideas that didn't
and they
happen.
do everything I tell them to.
Right.
Right. And if they don't do what I tell them to, I delete them,
Right.
and the world doesn't work that way. Listen, family obviously is key. I've been married, to the same person for 37 years.
Yeah.
And she's not going to put up with my editing her, she will not do what I say, and I can't retype her,
I think I'm married to the same woman.
Yeah, it could be. It sounds like it. I used to do a lot of volunteering in schools. And I might do that some more. I started a Shakespeare program here in our little rural town in California, Shakespeare for elementary school kids.
Nice.
They perform actual Shakespeare plays, scaled down, but all of Shakespeare's original language. And that's been going on for, I want to say this is the 26th year. I think I directed it for its first 10, but I write, I do the adaptations. I directed high school musicals for 6 years. Not been a huge fan, but that's what the kids wanted to do. We live in a sort of a resource poor town, and so I think volunteerism is important.
Sure.
I'm pretty active politically on Twitter, so that's sort of a larger, I think, kind of community. That my partner Shane Salerno and I are talking to all the time, seeing friends, and I think that COVID has enforced a kind of a different view for us on these things. It didn't change my work life a lot because, as you said, we spent it all locked up anyway.
Right.
But then, not being able to have dinner with dear friends or, go out or whatever, go to a freaking movie,
Yeah.
I think we're looking at those things a little differently now, aren't we? Like what's really valuable? How do we want to spend our time?
Yeah.
So I get out, but the sad truth is you're absolutely right. Most of the time we spend alone. And most of my reading is research reading. So yeah, it's an issue.
The new book, City on Fire, when you're hearing this, is available everywhere. We're going to put links to it where you can grab it in Kindle edition or hardcover or audiobook. Don, I've just recently gotten into your audiobooks. I've read a number of your hardcovers throughout the years, but to be able to keep up with a show like this, I have to listen to a lot of audiobooks while I'm doing other things. And I've just discovered this whole new world for your books in audio. What have you heard any of the pre-release of City on Fire in audio?
Yeah, it's terrific. Yeah,
I love it. What do you think about having your work translated to audio?
It's flattering. It's fun. It's flattering. I know that a lot of people get their reading done. I don't mean that in any negative sense. While they're taking trips, while they're doing other things, I think it's a great thing. And of course that's where storytelling began.
Yeah.
The cavemen went out and they killed a mastodon, and then they came back and they narrated the story around the fire. And so I'm all for it.
Yeah. Well, if you want to experience the audiobook as well, we'll have a link in the show notes where you can grab it at Audible. Don, this has been so much fun chatting. I love the new book. I know that everyone else is going to as well. We're going to have links in the show notes, like I said. But if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, where can they find you online?
DonWinslow.com, and I'm on Twitter.
Excellent. What's your Twitter
handle? So there's a website,
handle?
DonWinslow.com. Don Winslow, yeah.
Great. We'll link that up as well. Don, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate your time. I enjoyed the conversation. It's just fun. So nice to talk with you, Hank.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On Walpurgis night, when the moon is high, hell's bells ring and witches must answer. They dapple their breasts with rendered fat of murdered babes, straddle their brooms and take to the sky, as the devil wills, to speed through dreamy midnight air to the summit of the Brockenberg, that haunted peak shrouded in swirling mists, where a glen of gnarled limbs and wan moonlight awaits to host their debauches and blasphemies. Now to the Brocken the witches ride, the stubble is gold and the corn is green, there shall the Carnival Sabbath be seen, and the devil shall come to preside. The accuser elopes from the bowels of hell, a sure-footed, goat-headed, many-horned beast with cloven hooves and a staff of bone. He perches upon the witch altar to brood in cerulean half-light, a winged silhouette with watchful red eyes. The witches gather and bow to their master, upon his charred rump give the shameful kiss, then imps beat the drum and a round dance begins. Lash yourselves into frenzy, hags! Pass the chalice of pure marrow broth. Whip the ground with your hair, tread the sky with your feet, dance with joined hands around Satan's cold fire. Then find out a nook of nettles and moss, and lay with the rough-skinned beast of your choosing, suckling some rancid teat of desire. But hist! The cock crows. Away, away! Gather your tatters and broomsticks and wits, back to your huts, to your thresholds and hearths, and become once more, at the red break of day, the furtive adder in your neighbor's garden. The ghost host of the Salem Sorcery Tour, dazzling in his steampunk Victorian morning crepe, let the spell he'd woven trail through the twilight air like a hag across the moon, then chirped, "Isn't that silly?" and bowed, sweeping the wet grass with his satin-ribboned top hat. The tour group gave a polite round of applause. Nobody believes that stuff today, but the Puritans sure did. They took witches very seriously. If they went down in the morning and bought eggs, and one was rotten, surely the devil had come in the night, gone boop, tee-hee-hee, then scampered off on his little hooves. And who's in league with the devil? Witches. We're taught that the Puritans were super nice and cute with little buckles on their hats, but it's not the case, folks. They were fanatics. Witch hunts don't happen in a healthy society. They hated kids. They hated women. They were crazy. And that craziness. He turned on the spot, casting a protective circle around the stone garden of the witch memorial. Got these people killed